Welcome to the next installment of the Risk Management video series. My name is Matt Johnson. I am counsel of the New Hampshire Association of Realtors and a shareholder at Divine Millimet. With me today is Josh Greenwald, a member of our Risk Management Subcommittee. The topic for today's video is the financing contingency provisions in the purchase and sale agreement from the perspective of the seller. I would say, as a legal matter, this is an important but yet frustrating aspect for the seller because the deals are almost always contingent upon the buyer obtaining financing. The purchase and sale agreement tries to strike a fair balance by giving the buyer the obligation to, within a certain amount of time, submit an application to at least one financial institution to get financing, and it then gives a get-out-of-jail-free card to the buyer if by a certain date the buyer pulls or sends written notice that they cannot meet their financing contingency. They're not able to gain financing, and therefore, if that happens, the purchase and sale agreement terminates, and the buyer is entitled to get their deposit back. That, from a legal standpoint, is how it is supposed to work. But how it's supposed to work in practice and how it does work in practice, I'm going to turn it over to Josh to give some thoughts about what happens in the real world.
Thanks, Matt. So a common misconception is that the responsibility of the loan is for the buyer and the buyer's agent, and then we'll just sit back and watch them do their job. It is very important going in that you know what the financing terms are going to be. All right, look through that financing contingency. And yeah, it does play a factor, how much money they're putting down, what type of loan they're going for, because then you need to prepare your seller what to expect throughout the loan process. With an FHA loan or a VA loan, you're looking at much more strict lending practices in terms of condition. So that's something to keep in mind when evaluating the offer. Other factors such as what rate are they putting in that they have to get. My personal recommendation is anything other than prevailing is a no-go because, again, that is their out. They're, like you said, Matt, their get-out-of-jail-free card. If they don't get by 0.1% of a percentage point, technically they can back out of the deal. Also, take a look at their pre-qualification or pre-approval. Call the lender, ask them questions. I know it's kind of hard to get information because it is confidential for the buyer, but you need to give information to the seller so then they can make an informed decision as to whether or not the terms are going to work out. Because at the end of the day, you will be sitting and waiting for that appraisal and underwriting to go through before you can start packing your things.
I think that's great. And the one thing I would add on the legal side is, again, obviously realtors are not financial advisors to their clients, but you guys have all seen innumerable pre-qualification letters and commitment letters. So my suggestion is absolutely you talk to the sellers about them, particularly if what you see is different or outside of the custom of what you're traditionally seeing in the marketplace, because that does raise a red flag that maybe the likelihood of being able to get the financing or the likelihood of them actually triggering that financing contingency may go up. So the seller needs to be prepared for that. And that could be a real factor in when you're balancing two relatively comparable offers. If one has a simpler, cleaner, more straightforward financing terms than the other, that could be a valuable factor to weigh, and is something the seller should consider for sure.
Well, absolutely. And don't forget also, there's the baseball umpire in this transaction, and that's the appraiser. Okay, because at the end of the day, they are going to determine whether or not that bank lends that money. All right. So even if you're down the process and the buyer has all the credentials to get the loan, the house must meet value in order for the bank to approve that loan. So you, as the seller, have to present a good product. It's really the last showing of the home. And unfortunate reality is that the market will determine whether or not your property is valued or not. So the appraisal is one of the biggest roadblocks of real estate transactions these days and must be taken very seriously when you're pricing homes, that they are appraisal-proof listing prices.
So that's a good segue, though, and staying on the practical. So I've outlined a little bit legally what happens and what if the buyer misses the financing contingency, and so that the sale or the closing is no longer contingent upon obtaining financing. Legally, that means the contract, the seller could force the buyer to close on the transaction because they don't have a legal out. But practically speaking, that's not how it works, is it? Right?
No, not at all. Because at the end of the day, if they can't get the money to buy the house, they're not going to buy the house. and your objective is to sell the house. So therefore, you should move on to somebody who can buy the house. All right. So we can talk about and reflect later about what went wrong, but at the end of the day, you need a viable buyer for your client, which also unfortunately results in returning the house to the market if the buyer does in fact end up getting a denial of financing.
Right. And at that point, the remedy, the most effective or efficient remedy, is usually retaining the deposit because the buyer has breached the purchase and sale agreement. But I agree with you, Josh, completely. You have to keep your eye on the prize, and the prize is selling the house. So you can't get too focused on the transaction that didn't close. You need to go out and find a new buyer and find, to get a transaction that will close. So that's good advice.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts on that? Otherwise, I think we're all set on this topic.
No, I feel pretty good about it. Just watch the contract, and you're the general contractor of the transaction. So make sure that everything gets done and that the lender and the buyer's agent and the buyer and the seller is doing everything that they said that they would do so you can get to a smooth transaction.
Great advice and a great way to end. Thank you so much, Josh.
Thank you.